Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am, as you may notice, not your usual face. Kathleen is out today. My name is Lucy Hochstartner. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director at Maine Conservation Voters. So glad everybody can make it to our live lunch and learn today, a youth voice in climate justice, the Held v. Montana case. And thank you to everyone watching the recording. Amazing. Thanks, Maggie, who's also here doing our usual slides. In advance of the exciting featured speaker at the Evening for the Environment, so our in-person event coming up soon, Phil Gregory, co-counsel for our Children's Trust, is speaking at that event. Today we have youth plaintiff from one of the youth cases, Grace Gibson-Snyder, who's going to join us to bring her story to life. In landmark climate cases, youth plaintiffs are often the people taking a stand for climate justice. And I will just say I'm so excited for this Lunch and Learn in particular, because Grace is one of the young people represented by our Children's Trust in the Held v. State of Montana lawsuit. And I was a young person in Montana, so Grace was standing up for me, and I have experience dealing with the Montana government on climate issues. They are not doing the right thing. So the courts were kind of the only avenue left. And Grace is going to share her first-hand experience as a plaintiff, agreeing to participate, testifying at trial, and becoming a voice for youth in the climate movement. The Held case challenges state support for fossil fuels and seeks to affirm young people's constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. So tune in to hear Grace's inspiring story of youth activism and the power of young voices in shaping the future. As I said earlier, my name is Lucy Hochstartner. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Voters Alliance, my Maine Conservation Alliance. And our two organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action, and more. And just a few notes before today's program. We're going to hear from our speaker first, Grace, and then tackle your questions in a Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. Please send your question to me or Maggie through the chat as they occur and come to you. We'll synthesize and ask as many as possible in following the presentation. We do ask that you not message speakers, Grace, directly. We want Grace to be able to stay focused on her presentation and not the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, just message Maggie through the chat and she will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where a number of playlists can help you focus in on particular topics. Finally, I just wanted to add that we are on land that was taken violently, and that violence, which includes climate change, is ongoing. As part of this community of people who now live here, we all have a role to play in addressing these issues. Today, I'm reaching out from Lake Placid, where the Canyon-Cuyahoga people have lived for generations. The climate crisis is particularly poignant for tribal citizens whose identity is deeply intertwined with the land. Enrolled members of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and Crow tribe are among the plaintiffs suing the state of Montana over its contributions to climate change. In our afternoon email, we will share an article that highlights some of their testimony on the impact of climate change on cultural heritage. In our work, we are not only supporting the Wabanaki in their efforts to secure their full sovereignty rights and rematriate land, but we are also seeking to fight climate change in ways that builds power to counter these systems of oppression. This email will also include ways to move from learning to action in supporting both our organization and these awesome plaintiffs, and emphasizing the importance of learning from Indigenous communities in our fight against climate change. And Grace, the floor is now over to you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Hello, everyone. My name is Grace. I will get started on a presentation in a minute, but I just wanted to introduce myself while you can still see my face a little bit bigger. I am 20, soon to be 21 years old. I am an undergraduate student at Yale, so I'm down in Connecticut, but over at least on your coast. And I have never been to Maine, but I've heard it is the Montana of the East Coast. So I'm trying to get up there before I finish school. I grew up in Montana for the most part, lived in Seattle for a couple years, but born and mostly raised in Montana, and my family's been there for about 5 generations. So came over on the wagon train. And so, it's I'm glad I'm speaking to you guys because I think you all probably understand better than most Americans what it's like to live in a place where you're deeply connected to the outdoors and where you can see it around you and you can feel it and you understand humans' reliance on the natural world. And so I guess I just want to say that kind of as the backdrop for this case and for my upbringing, and why I think this action is so important. So I will do my best to screen share. Even my generation is not very good at this. Let's see. Okay. How are we looking? Is that
That's
good?
perfect.
Awesome. So that's me testifying or getting swearing in to testify, but that's later down the line. We'll get to that part of the story here in a little bit. So these are all the plaintiffs, and I want to take a moment to recognize that I am not the only plaintiff in this case. There are 16 of us. When we filed, we ranged from ages 2 to 18, so we are now about 6 to 22, if my math is correct. And we're from all over the state. I have a map here in a second from where we're all from, but these people have been, so crucial to the success of this case, but also to my experience being a plaintiff. This has been, just as much as this has been a legal effort, it also has been a remarkable exercise in kind of building community across the state of people from very different backgrounds and recognizing the kind of the universality of climate change as an issue, that it affects people regardless of party, regardless of background. And so these other young people have been incredible to work with, and I'm so grateful to all of them. I wish I could tell you all of their names, but that would take us a little bit. So this is the map from where we're all from. We've got, most of Montana's population is on the west side, which is why we're mostly from there. So we're from all these different spots, and we've got Ricky, who's actually our lead plaintiff. She was the oldest when we filed. She's out in Broadus, Montana, on a 5,000-acre cattle ranch. So it's very traditional Montana background. And in these plaintiffs, we have everyone from competitive skiers, like in college, to big hunters and fishermen. We've got people like me who played soccer in high school and lived in one of the bigger towns. And then we've got folks who grew up on a couple of our different reservations and have a lot of their testimony surrounding the ways climate change is impacting their heritage and their traditions. And so, like I said, diverse array of backgrounds that is, I think, crucial to the power of our case, and both like the rhetorical power and also the legal power of our arguments. So here's where the story gets a little bit sad. Growing up in Montana, I can see the world changing around me. For me, it was most noticeable first in wildfire smoke, because as I mentioned I played soccer all through high school, very big soccer kid here. I would have practices in the summer before the school year started, and we would have to cancel practice, cancel games because the smoke was so bad, because it settles into the Missoula Valley. It gets hard to breathe. I mean, it just itches your throat. I don't know how often Maine gets smoke, but if you've experienced this, you know what I'm talking about. It sits in your throat, it itches, sits in your nose, your eyes are like, what's going on? And they're all itchy. And that was just for me, and a bunch of kids on our team, as well as several kids in the case, all have asthma, and that really is even much more painful for them, and inhibits their ability to be outside and to play soccer and to do the things that they love. And so that was watching the wildfire smoke get worse and worse over, throughout high school for me was a firsthand recognition that something is wrong. Another experience for me was right after I graduated high school, which is 4 years ago now. It's crazy. I went to Glacier National Park with a bunch of my friends. Classic graduation trip. We just drove up there and went for a hike, and it was gorgeous. It's like a 10-mile hike. You go up and around a mountain, and at the top there's a glacier. And we walked up to the glacier and we're just kind of sitting by it. But there was this roar of water cascading over the edge of the cliff. And it was, the runoff. And to be fair, this was in the summer, like runoff is natural, ice does melt in the summer. But it was intense because I've grown up seeing the pictures, comparing glaciers, several decades ago, 100 years ago to now. And so being in the presence of one and seeing runoff, some natural and some exacerbated by climate change it was really quite painful to realize that these, experiences that I've had growing up might not be available to my kids, definitely not their kids, if we don't do something soon to turn this around. That kind of leads into kind of the other category besides physical impacts, is the mental health impacts. And this is a large part of what I testified about, what's in our complaint, which is that as a young person, climate change raises a lot of concerns and a lot of kind of internal conflict. For me, there's maybe two big categories of this. One is the question of my own involvement. What is my responsibility in this situation? And now as a person, I'm 20, almost 21, and gonna graduate soon, gonna enter the workforce. I would say by most measures, I'm mostly an adult. And so, I am phasing out of the young, or the children's role in this and trying to figure out now, what is my responsibility as someone who still doesn't have very much power, right? I'm not in the government. I'm not a billionaire. I'm not running a corporation. Like what is my power? And also, why should I have to be doing this? Why is my generation now at the center of all the conversations about climate? And there's a lot more to say about this than I have time for now, but I think often we focus so much on centering youth in these conversations that we don't listen to what the youth are saying. And I think youth have made our desires very clear over the last decade even. We want emissions to go down. We want fossil fuel systems to be gradually replaced by a more sustainable alternative, and we want to see our future be livable. And I think that's enough to work with for these people in power to be getting this stuff done. Another piece of the mental health impacts is, for me, whether I want to have kids. And I mean, that's a question that everyone thinks about at some point, but I think it's made much more complicated when the question is not only do I want to have kids, but it's also, do I want to raise kids in a world where they are experiencing the same loss and grief that I've grown up with, or when they're experiencing physical impacts of climate change, when things are worse in a decade and 2 decades, do I want to bring in another person in a developed country who will be using these resources, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an important question for people to think about, but I think it's notable that I and a lot of other plaintiffs and youth are thinking about this at age 14, when we're like, I am so scared for the future that I'm already thinking about the ethics of having children at that age. And so that was a lot of my motivation for trying to be more involved in the climate movement. So I joined the case. I'll give that little quick story. At age 16, so halfway through high school, And I'd already been doing some environmental work, more on kind of the plastic side of things, trying to reduce um, my my hometown's plastic waste in the restaurant industry. Um, but I was doing research for that, and I read this figure that the US uses 500 million plastic straws a day. And I was like, "Oh my good lord, how in the world am I supposed to be doing anything about that number?" How is my individual action or even my local action in my hometown gonna make a dent in that? My natural conclusion from that question was, well, we need policy. We need the government to be putting guardrails on this so that, you know, I don't have to be thinking about it, so that it does not become the individual's responsibility, but that our choices are naturally guided towards a more sustainable option. And so I was like, I want to make an impact on the policy level, but I'm 16. And then I got incredibly lucky where this lawsuit was happening in my home state. And so I heard about the Help v. Montana lawsuit. They were um, about to file a complaint, and there was still a window of opportunity to become a plaintiff. And so I talked to my parents. I was like, "What do you think?" And they're like, "Well, it's never going to go anywhere, but it'd be a good learning opportunity." So I emailed the attorneys, and I was like, "Hi, this sounds cool." And we had a bunch of meetings. I was suddenly a plaintiff in this lawsuit, and then 5 years later, here we are. And we are, the first lawsuit of its kind to have a victory in court, etc. And so, very exciting stuff. Did not see it coming at all. Um, and so I was a part of this case, and then through it, in conjunction with just, learning high school, other work, I began to learn about the fossil fuel system in Montana, which I think is something you grow up with, because I mean, I see coal trains all the time. Every time I'm on the highway, there is a coal train next to the highway. And I want to take a second to recognize that the fossil fuel system has been very good to Montana for a long time. It is what this kind of extractive industry is what the state is based on. First it was mining and particularly copper mining, and then it has the biggest coal reserves in the country, and in one of the biggest in the world. And so this has been the foundation of our economy for a long time, and I don't want to disregard that, because that's where we come from. However, for a long time, conservation or environmental work and extractive industry could coexist, right? Because the harms that you were seeing from these um, extractive behaviors were very localized. And all of a sudden, when climate change came into the public eye, these two behaviors are mutually exclusive, right? You can't have a livable climate and these extractive industries together. And so it's causing a bit of an identity crisis in Montana that we're not um super we haven't solved it yet. We're still working on it. And so I guess on the screen here we have just pictures of Montana's fossil fuel system, but um it's a big big part of our state. We have some of the biggest. The bottom right here is the coal strip generating plant. I will note this picture is taken in the winter. This is mostly steam coming out of these. It looks a lot worse than it is, but it's not to disregard the impacts of what is coming out of those plants, both in terms of direct pollution and also carbon emissions. And so, but I've had a lot of conversations with people in Colstrip, and they're very mad about pictures like this being used. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And so this is kind of the context that we're working in, right? The other important context is the Montana Constitution. This is my favorite part of the case. Our Constitution is super cool and quite unique. We had a constitutional convention in the early 70s, and so it's a pretty young constitution. And in that convention, they added the right to a clean and healthful environment, which is a very unique right. There's a couple other state constitutions that have something similar and or are adding something similar. There's a big push for that right now, but this is quite cool and quite rare, and I think is a testament to the conservationist history in Montana, that a very purple and now red state has such deep conservationist ideology that they'll put it in their constitution. So very cool. There's also, that's kind of the right that we talk about the most because it's the fun one, but our case is also based on a lot of other rights for people. So individual dignity, equal protection of the laws. There's explicit protection of children, of people under 18, that guarantees that we have the same rights as adults. There's the rights to safety, health, life, liberty, and property, all of which are very tied to climate impacts, as you can imagine. And so the premise of our case, and I'm going to keep the legal jargon to a minimum because A, I'm not a lawyer, and B, Phil Gregory, one of our attorneys, will be presenting here shortly, and so I will leave that to the experts, and I'll just give you the basic rundown. If you have questions, I can try to answer them. But for those of you who are legally minded, please ask Phil. So the premise of our case is that there is a law in Montana. There was a law in Montana that says that when the government is permitting fossil fuel projects, energy projects, development, it cannot consider the effects of that project on climate change. Okay. And so it can't consider effects outside the border. It can't consider how it's affecting greenhouse gas emissions. So it really restricts the environmental review process, basically. I keep saying present tense. I gotta learn how to switch to the past tense because it no longer exists. And so that was the law that we were challenging specifically, is saying that disregarding the climate impacts of these projects is causing harm to Montana's youth. It's causing harm through our our property rights and the way we enjoy ourselves outside and our health, et cetera, our right to a future. And so our case sought to overturn that law, and I'm kind of spoiler here, but we won. And so that law is no longer in place, which means that when doing environmental review for new mines, new power plants, etc., the government has to consider what effect those will have on the climate crisis. And yeah, I'll stop there. There's so much to say about that. But so I get often people are like, cool, got that. Why are you a part of this? What are you doing exactly? So I'll walk you through exactly what my role as a plaintiff was, because it's a very weird job that not a lot of people get to do. So for me, right when I joined the case, so when I was 16, the first project was writing the complaint for the case. So this is like what you file to start the lawsuit, and it has, what are my harms? Why am I being harmed? Why am I a part of this case? And so this is a lot of the stuff I told you, right? Wildfire smoke harms, glaciers melting, the river levels changing. This is even more important to me now. I worked as a river raft guide last summer, and the water was extraordinarily low. It was the lowest my boss had ever seen it, basically. And so it is, and that's, it sounds trivial because it's fun. It's a fun job, river raft guiding, but it's super central to our recreational industry, our tourist industry. Like these things have secondary effects on Montana's economy and on people's income, etc. The next thing that I did was a deposition. So I went home from school, from college, my first winter break, and sat in a room and got interviewed by the defense lawyers for about 3 hours. So that was a fun break. But basically they ask you questions about your impacts, really everything, your family history, like so many slightly invasive questions. But then the exciting part was trial. Last June, so a year and a little bit ago, we had a 10-day trial. And so this was 5 days for our arguments, and then the defense, the state, was going to have 5 days. They used a day of that, just 1 day of that. They didn't have a lot of arguments to make, but we'll get to that in a second. For me, the trial was two things. It was my own testimony, which happened on the very first day. And which is again a lot of the same stuff I've told you about, the mental health impacts, physical impacts, and then the rest of it was quite fun. It was a weirdly fun experience, partly because I got to get to know all the plaintiffs because it's a big state. We're not like visiting each other all that often. So I got to hang out with them. We had a pool party, we had movie nights, like we were having a great time getting to know each other. Um, the bad part of the trial was watching the state's attorneys constantly try to undermine our arguments and our experiences, and everything from blatant lies to kind of shifty attitudes, and they were obviously unsuccessful, but still the feeling that you're I've approached my government, I'm asking them to change something in order to help me to protect its citizens, and to have the government say, no, you're wrong, we won't do that, we don't care, repeatedly, both in court and out of court, with our elected officials making some really um, backhanded statements to the press. It's really disillusioning, and it really makes you um, it made me frustrated and sad with the state of our um, political system. Can save that for another time though. The testimony, as I mentioned, it was really powerful to watch other plaintiffs testify. I mean, about their own impacts, about their own emotions, and to see that there were 15 other people my age that were having as intensive emotions about this as I was. I cried like every day in court, I think. So it was an intense experience, but it was also really, really powerful to sit there and watch my friends be given a voice, and then to sit there myself and know that I had 20 minutes to say whatever I want to the judge, to the defense attorneys, to the state, to the public. It was really powerful. We also had 10 experts testify and several others who wrote in support of us. They had expertises everywhere from like Montana's fossil fuel policy history to glaciers to mental health to physical health for children, like all over the place. They were incredible, and they've provided so much support for us over the years. So I want to put them all up here and recognize how much they brought to the case. It was really incredible. The defense's case, like I mentioned, they had 3 people testify. They're up here on the screen. The premise, they have a couple arguments, and I can go into these in more detail if people are interested, but basically we're just following the rules. We like in the environmental review process, we have no control over this. A lot of like Montana's emissions are insignificant, and that is what I want to touch on actually. First of all, they're not that insignificant because we're a big exporter of coal, and so we have a big impact on the global fossil fuel regime. But also, I don't think it matters that if we are small, because and this is, we'll see in a second, this the judge agreed with me, but every ton of carbon dioxide matters. Reducing every little bit of climate change is going to help in the long run. So maybe it's better that the small places start and give the bigger places a model of how to make this transition work. And so I won't say anything else negative about the defense's case, but they weren't successful because then we won. And so this decision came out in August of last year. I was literally en route to school when this came out, and so I was like staying with a friend and like woke up to a text from my attorney being like, get on the phone. And then we all cried together for a little bit, but this was a remarkable day. Front page of the New York Times. And I think it's cool to see how much excitement there was around this, because I mean, people don't really understand it very well, and there's like a lot of confusion about what we were actually doing, but people are so desperate for positive news about climate change. And that was, I was glad to be able to bring that to people. I'm very proud to be a part of this. Even Michael Gerard, who is at Columbia Law, and a, a known hard to please climate lawyer, thought this was a super strong decision issued by the judge, Judge Seeley. She wrote an amazing document called the Findings of Facts and Conclusions of Law, which, it was over 100 pages, which is really abnormal. She was incredibly thorough with her findings, and she addressed each of the plaintiffs' testimony individually by name, said this is what Grace is experiencing, this is what Sariel is experiencing, and this is why it matters. And that was the most validating thing of all time. It was incredible to read this and say, this judge recognized word for word what we are experiencing and what we are asking for. So an incredible decision. Judge Seeley has now been recognized in several law circles for her decision here. The current status of the case, naturally, the state decided to continue fighting the case, and they appealed to the Montana Supreme Court. And so we had a oral arguments in the Supreme Court this summer, much less exciting than the trial. It's like an hour and a half, and it's mostly for show. And so we all sat in the courtroom, and one of our attorneys gave an incredible, presentation, basically recap of everything that happened in trial, because the Supreme Court already has all the information from trial. So this is more just like updates. And then the defense also has time to state their case, and then the justices ask questions, which was very cool to watch, and to see what sorts of things they were interested in. And so we're waiting on a decision from the Supreme Court still. It'll probably be by the end of this year, we expect. And we'll see how this goes. I'm confident in our arguments and in our and in the rightness of our case. But we'll see if the court agrees. Common misconception, this case can't go to another court because it's on the Montana it's on the Montana Constitution, excuse me. And so this is two and done. So this decision is final, and I am confident that it will be upheld, and that we'll see some really substantive changes in Montana's policies moving forward. I'm going to call my presentation there, and then we'll happy to take any questions that you guys have. Just want to remark on a couple action items. Like I said, Attorney Phil, love him. He's got some great dance moves. He will be speaking at the Evening for the Environment, and he is so much more knowledgeable on the law side of this than I am. So, and as well as, all the other parts that I talked about. So if you're interested in hearing more, please talk to Phil. There's a show called Youth v. Gov on Netflix, and this is about our law firm, which is called Our Children's Trust. And they have a bunch of other cases in other states. One in Hawaii just went to settlement, which is very exciting. There's a case in Alaska. There's a federal case, Juliana versus United States, and that's mostly what Youth v. Gov is about. So highly recommend watching that. And then if you have interest in supporting Our Children's Trust's work moving forward, both like the legal side of things, the actual suing, and also implementing and making sure that these decisions are upheld and that they actually do something, all of that work, you can support Our Children's Trust online, both through financially and also a bunch of calls to action. So anything you can do, I appreciate, Phil appreciates, all the other plaintiffs in my case and others. So thank you so much for having me here today. Happy to take any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that. And I'm just gonna put such a plug in for Grace. She's fantastic. This case was fantastic. she's downplaying the oral arguments, but I was there. I had gone to Montana to visit a friend for a wedding this summer and dropped by the oral arguments, and all the plaintiffs were fabulous, sitting there looking stoic as they needed to. Um, and You Speak Up is just an amazing movie and definitely would recommend watching and coming to the evening for the environment. But we do have a bunch of questions for Grace, and if you have them, keep putting them in the chat. But just a first question, Grace, curious whether, I guess maybe just we'll start with a clarifying question. And I think I know what you were referring to here. But on your note about the state's defense and the economist who couldn't do math, like what was the state's defense like? And I think the thing that I'm going to add to that question, how did it make you feel to see like the way the state put their defense together?
Great question. It I'm gonna start with how it made me feel. It was simultaneously, this is all a little bit in confidence, please don't go announcing this to reporters, but it was simultaneously really frustrating and also quite entertaining. Um, because, frustrating, like I said, to see the state resisting, to see their arguments, that some of them were just wrong. Like I was like, I don't, it was frustrating to see the government spending so many resources and paying these experts to fight the case of the people. It was entertaining because there were some serious errors that the judge reacted to, and did not so she ended up not accepting Terry Anderson here, the economist that they had testify. She did not accept his what he said in court was struck from the record, because she's like, yeah, he was just wrong. For example, and this is the one why it says I cannot do math. I did not make this slide, just to be clear. But he submitted a piece of paper with some numbers on, I think, global population, and it listed global population as 7 million, which the judge then says, I think you're missing a couple zeros here. And so just that level of like, what is going on exactly? So, yes, that was a notable moment in the state's defense. And this is not to ridicule any of these people individually. They all do. Sonia in particular does great work at the DEQ. And I'm hoping to connect with the DEQ. I mean, they have a very important role in Montana, and not to dismiss their work. We're just trying to hold them to a higher standard, or to a different standard entirely. So
Thanks so much for that, Grace. And yeah, I remember reading some of like the live tweets about this case, and just some of these experts, man, the expertise was lacking. Another thing that some folks are wondering, Grace, is this has obviously been just a total whirlwind, a lot going on, and you're doing this while you're doing school. Like I know other people are doing this as they're doing sports and work. What would you say to Maine's young people? And I'm even just going to expand it to other young people. I'm going to include myself in that. We're like so concerned about extreme storms, climate change, all of the things we're seeing. Not everyone can be in a case like you were. What would you say to young people? Like it sounds like that experience was so validating of being able to tell the state, like, this is what you're doing to me, and this is how it hurts. What would you say to other young people who are feeling those same things? What can they do?
God, I have so many thoughts on this, so I'll try to keep it short. First, I think it's really easy to feel like you're the only one who cares. Which is weird because it's always in the media. We know there's so many groups out there talking about this, working on this, like dozens of groups in every state, federally. Like there's so many people who care. But it's a very isolating, I think fear is a very isolating emotion. And so trying to remember that it's not our job alone. It's not my job. It's not your job. And this is a collective action. And that's something that I really struggle with because I like to be in charge of things and I like to make them happen on my own. I really don't like group projects. And so, for me, I just want to find the solution and I want to make it happen and I want it to be over. And it's very hard to sit in that place of like, that's not how this works. But trying to find people that you trust, that you feel heard by, and whose work feels meaningful. And for me, I found that for the first time at our children's trust, where I was like, I love these people. They have such good vibes. They're so effective in what they do. And this feels like a place for me. Um, the other thing I'll say is like, I alluded to this earlier, but I'm very torn on the role of youth in the climate movement. Just something I have to think about a lot because people ask me about this a lot. But I think I'm torn. On one hand, I'm like, I want everyone to do everything they can to fix this, right? And on the other hand, it shouldn't be our job. It should have been solved decades ago. And we're still not powerful as youth. We're not, at least as individual youth. There's certainly power in the movement. And so I think for me, what I've realized is that the role of youth is to ask for help. In that we're saying, this is what's wrong, and you, people in power, need to fix it, right? You need to help us with this problem. We are, the role of youth, I think for decades, centuries, has been to hold the people in power to a higher standard, to say, this is what the people want. This is what the next generations want. This is what needs to change. And to be that sort of public pressure, which causes that change. And I think there's probably hundreds of ways you can go about that. I mean, we all think of protests and we think of lobbying. I hadn't thought of being in a lawsuit, but that's what I ended up doing. I think there's a lot of ways to be that sort of pressure. But I think I would encourage young people, and really all people that are not the ones in the positions of extreme power, to be that role of getting those people in power to do something, because nothing's going to change until they do something, whether that's corporations or billionaires or government officials. It is their job, so hold them to doing their job well.
Thank you so much for that, Grace. And I just think that that was such an eloquent way of putting that, because it shouldn't be our problem, and yet it is our problem. So we can't just leave it there. And I definitely remember struggling with that a lot, and knowing that sometimes young people can be uniquely effective, and also trying to protect even younger people. Like right now, I'm an elder young person, and often when I was working in Montana, like I'd have reporters come up to me and be like, "So where's the high schooler? Can I talk to them?" I'd be like, "Well, the high schooler isn't ready to talk to a reporter, so like you can talk to me, and maybe later you can talk to a high schooler." And so just needing to like constantly negotiate that. And I think something along with that is what can adults do to be better allies? What is the role of adults in this movement, particularly adults that, I heard you saying the people in power need to get with the program, but adults who maybe also don't have that power, maybe are feeling powerless themselves, how can they support young people in this work?
Yeah, to your point on the people asking to interview high schoolers, my reaction is always like, stop making high schoolers think about this. It's not their job. But that's, okay, moving on. As for adults, it's hard. I wish there was a one step to-do list that I could tell you, this is what you can do. And maybe I'll be slightly controversial here and say it's great to support young people's voices, and that actually does really need to happen always. It's always a good thing to be doing. But youth often get pigeonholed into being youth, right? Like I'm always presented as like the youth activist, which I think really limits how people see me. And so if you can break out of that when you're engaging with youth, that's nice for us. And say, what are they asking for? And how can I relieve their burden instead of continuing to ask them to lead? How can I take some of that away from them and make them feel like, they have been heard and they can go back to being children. What that looks like, I think, really depends on, what you're interested in and what your engagement is with youth. And you don't even have to talk to youth. That could just be like, I'm going to dedicate time to connecting with my state representatives, connecting with my federal representatives, connecting with my cousin's wife who's the CEO of a whatever, and trying to use those personal connections. Like, I think there's a lot of ways change can be brought about. It can be supporting organizations financially if that's, the best resource that you have to give. But I think I'm trying to be unique here and stay away from the content and say more kind of on a theoretical level, doing what you can to make youth not have the burden, whatever that looks like for you.
That's so great, Grace. And I could not agree more. And I think it really is so easy to get pigeonholed as a young person. I know, like, one of the things that I've struggled with is like, you've got some power when you're a young person, and you've got some power maybe once you get power, but what do you do in the in between times? And I sort of heard you maybe mentioning that in your presentation of like kind of trying to figure out your role right now. And that just brings us to another question that folks have is, did you have any training throughout this case to make people take you more seriously? Did you have to focus on your presentation? Was there anything, or did you just show up and you're like, I'm Grace, this is who I am, this is how I present myself?
That's a great question. I actually don't know if I've ever been asked that before. So someone's thinking creatively. Kind of all of the above. So on one hand, right, my job is just to tell the truth of my experience. Like, that's what I was doing in court. I was saying, this is what I've seen, this is what I felt. Ta-da. So in that sense, it's a very kind of authentic experience. On the other hand, there's this weird kind of, and this is not imposed by anyone, this is not like the lawyers are making me do something, but for my own kind of reflection, there's a weird line to walk, right, where I'm not like a kid anymore, or even really through most of the case, but I'm not really an adult. And so, like, I think trying to walk the line of, am I trying to be perceived as an adult who knows things and who studied things and has credibility, or am I trying to be perceived as a kid who has like the pathos, like, I'm really cute, please take care of me? And like, I really didn't check either box. And so I've had to choose kind of in different scenarios what I'm trying to emphasize. Um, in terms of literal training, like, no one's told me how to solve that. No one's like, this is who you need to be, which is part of the reason I love our children's trust, is because they are the least invasive group. Like, there, especially around the trial time, there was a lot of publications that were like, or I think even one of our state representatives said that we are young, naive children being manipulated by out-of-state interest groups, which, ouch. But it's just simply not, it's just so far from the truth with our children's trust, because they're so youth led. They're so like, what do you want to see happen? Like, we have made legal decisions in our case, with lawyers explanation, because we don't know what's going on, because we don't know how to read legal jargon, but like, we lead the decisions in this case, and I think that's often overlooked. But they have provided media training. They provided these slides for me to use. I put them all together. Their role is to support us and what we ask for and what we need help with, and they have done an incredible job on that. So yes and no, and authentic and inauthentic. Everything that you asked is kind of true at the same time.
we're just constantly trying to figure out how we're perceived. And I feel like there's just so many additional layers there. It's like young people, women, it's like there's just so many identities interacting there that I think make it sounds challenging, but also really rewarding when folks let you get it right, like our children's trust. And so I guess that brings me to another question. And I actually didn't know that you all made legal decisions. That's super cool. Um, have there, like, what's coming up next for Held? What are you, I know you're waiting for the decision, but say, it's upheld. What are you looking forward to in Montana? And has this case inspired any other cases around the world that you've heard about? Are you following those? Where else does our children's trust work?
Yeah. I suggest looking at their website. It's very well done. They have a bunch of other cases um that are in the same vein as this one, though it depends on the state, right, and what their constitution is, etc. I wanted to touch on the one in Hawaii just because I think it's really cool. This summer, the Hawaii plaintiffs were supposed to go to trial, right? There was a trial scheduled. And right before the trial happened, they announced that the state of Hawaii, specifically the Department of Transportation was the defendant in that case, they had agreed to settle with the plaintiffs. And so what this looks like is the state is designing a 20-year plan to decarbonize the transportation sector to zero, not net zero, and uh, and it will all be overseen by the court and the plaintiffs. And so I do think this represents two very different attitudes, Montana's versus Hawaii's, in terms of how to react to youth requests for change. And I think that can serve as a model for future governments who find themselves being sued. In terms of Montana specifically, um, and our I'm gonna maybe talk about what this means, what substantive changes will happen because of the case. Um, Basically, I talked about that law being overturned that prohibited climate change considerations of these permitting projects. Basically, this means in practice that now other environmental groups or a children's trust, I guess, but like Montana Environmental Information Center, um, Earth Justice, like a bunch of local groups, like all of them can sue again when the environmental review process is when they think it's insufficient, when they think that the state is permitting fossil fuels, etc., without considering climate change. Because the premise here, right, is that if you have to consider climate change in environmental reviews of extractive projects and contributing to climate change is unconstitutional, which is what was decided in our case, right? Those two things together should mean that these fossil fuel permitting projects should not be approved. So that's the substantive impact, and that will be upheld through possibly through like review processes actually doing their job, and possibly through a lot of other litigation shutting down the insufficient reviews.
Say some gas plants or some coal mines, maybe
Yeah, coal
not moving forward.
mines, yeah. There's a new gas plant being built that keeps shockingly running into litigation, so etc. Yeah.
That's awesome. And along those lines, Grace, you kind of alluded to it, like this could go well. They could just permit things the right way to start with, or it could take further lawsuits from those groups like Montana Environmental Information Council or Earth Justice, who would totally recommend folks look up as well. Um, some of what decides that is who is in power, who is in office. And Montana is somewhat unique in a lot of things are elected, like the Supreme Court is elected, the Attorney General is elected. Um, How are you thinking about voting this year, Grace? Are you worried about the outcome of the election for implementation of this case? And just like how have elections interacted with this case? So, like I was working on elections right before you all went to trial, and we were really thinking about like the Supreme Court race, um, and wanting to make sure that we had people on the Supreme Court who were going to do right by this case. But how has that played into all of your work?
Yeah. Yes, Montana is very unique in its kind of electability. Particularly Supreme Court justices. I mean, that is the what I would say is the never mind, I lied. I was gonna say that's the only way this is interacted with elections, but there's two ways actually. One, two of the justices right now, two seats are up for election. Two of them are retiring. And so that's left kind of in question for us when the Supreme Court decision is going to come out, because the question is like if they will release it before the election and let it be used as an election tool versus waiting until after the election and not politicizing the case, which would be my preferred outcome. And so that's interesting. And I think Montana has, like I said, a very kind of purple history and has the ability to elect moderates or maybe nonpartisan judges, etc. So I hope that that tradition continues in today's political landscape, and I hope that those types of elections escape kind of the extreme polarization of other elections. The other way that this case has been touched by not elections directly, but the legislature, and I skipped over this because it's technically not relevant to the case anymore, but basically the early in the case before trial, one of the ways the state tried to prevent trial was by changing the laws that we were challenging. So one of them, this one that we did end up changing, used to read, the state can't consider the effects of these projects outside state borders. So the implication was climate change, but then they changed it to just read climate change. And the judge was like, I think it still counts. And so we got to continue suing on that. The other thing, we were also challenging Montana's energy policy and the way it promoted fossil fuels over alternative energies. But the legislature just coincidentally decided to erase our energy policy entirely and just make it non-existent. And so we went from having a fossil fuel promoting energy policy to no energy policy for the state, which I think is dumb because of course we have an energy policy, even if it's not written down. But that part of our case was dismissed because there was no actual law to challenge anymore. So they have really got their fingers up in our case, this legislature. And so, indirectly, these elections do very much impact cases, but hopefully I think that is a rare example of kind of a failure in the division of government and the branches of government. And so I do hope that the reason the courts exist is a final resort. It's to balance partisanship and to balance misuses of power or attempts to usurp the Constitution. And that is what the courts are for. And in our case so far, the courts and Judge Seeley have upheld the Constitution, which is their job. So far so good.
Thank you so much, Grace. This was just wonderful, and you're the coolest. Maggie and I have been chatting this whole time, being like, Grace is just such a queen. And I just want to thank everyone for coming. And Grace, if you have any final words or like what you are doing next, right? I think it's like maybe for those of us who are older, a little wild to have such a like very public moment at a pretty young age. Like, are you like going right down this train, or are you taking a break? Like, is it just school? Is it sports, hanging out with your friends? Like, what's next for you personally?
Great question. I have no idea.
A classic.
Yeah, it's a question I've been asking myself too, right? Because I don't know. I'm getting to the point where I have to kind of start thinking about a career or continued education, and I haven't really made any decisions there. Don't know about law school. People always ask me that. not yet. I will not be going to law school straight out of college. That's the only decision I've made so far. Yeah, mostly trying to get through college, focus on graduating. It is weird though to have had like a hyper public moment. um where also no one knows who I am. It's like I'm a rock star for like 12 seconds and then no one knows who I am. It's very strange. But I am trying to acknowledge that that attention is important for the case and for our children's trust, and then also try to figure out separately what it is that I actually care about and want to pursue specifically, and not just be influenced by the 12 seconds of fame. So we'll see. We'll
Well,
see what this all
thank
ends up.
you so much, Grace. And I would just say what I always try to remember is that like deciding what you don't want to do, like going to law school right out of college, is still deciding something. So good luck with your midterms, enjoy your mid-semester break, and
Yeah,
just thank you to Grace, our children's trust, everyone on here. And Kathleen will be back next week. She'll be talking to two of the people who helped get the Climate Superfund bill passed in Vermont. So you don't want to miss it. And we'll be sending out all of these action items after this afternoon.
Thank
Awesome.
you all for having me. This was a lovely time.
Thank you
Feel
so
free to
much for
reach
joining.
out. Yeah, thank you. If you guys have more questions, feel free to reach out to our children's trust and they can connect you with me. So
Awesome. Thank you so
Awesome.
much, Grace.
Thank you.
thank you. Have a great day, everyone.